Hello, everyone. My name is Eamon Dillon, and I am the Vice President of Competitions for Management Consulting Group. This is our second video showcasing the Fall 2022 Dean's Case. And in this, we're going to talk about a case analysis example and provide a little bit of light on what you can present during your 10-minute presentation. So what we're going to cover today is an introduction to the case. We're then going to go into an example of a case analysis, which will be a model for what you could actually present yourselves, but please do not use any of the slide designs that we presented. We do enforce strong rules for the honor roll, as well as plagiarism. And if there are any instances of cheating, you can be disqualified, which will severely impact your Management 111 grade. We're then going to go into the helpful tips and any pointers that we think would help you in completing this case competition.
So just to introduce myself again from last video, my name is Matt Plotzker, and I'm the president of the Management Consulting Group. And right now, I want to talk a little bit about the components of the case and really what that structure looks like. And in addition to the generic intro slide and executive summary slide at the end, there are 5 main components that we want to see. The first one is the problem identification, where you identify a certain number of, and the number could be of your decision, certain number of problems. Then we want to go into recommendation, which we like breaking down into recommendation overview, and then further in-depth analysis of each of those recommendations. You'll see it later, so it makes a little bit more sense. The next thing we want to see is an implementation plan, followed by financial implications to really show exactly how you're going to get everything done and what the true cost of it is, before you jump into some risk considerations, which could show what happens if, let's say, our recommendation doesn't work. What's our plan B? Because all consultants at the end of the day should have a plan B in place to show that they have thought about all the options from all angles.
So in order to showcase the sample case example, we are going to give you a sample prompt of a case that we've used in the past. Now, Subway is a case competition that we held in previous years, and we're going to show you a sample deck that was used in that competition. So the sample prompt here is Subway needs to brainstorm new ways to grow since they've been falling behind the competition. And your task would be to provide strategies to expand Subway's customer base with quantitative and qualitative support from information found in either the exhibits in the case itself or from doing your external research online. Now, you do want to avoid common mistakes by conducting thorough research on this issue before making any recommendations or making any of the following slides. And it's important to actually identify problems before coming up with your recommendations. Even though it can be really fun to just throw a really good recommendation out there, you want to make sure that it actually ties to a real problem that is highlighted in the case and something that the company is actually facing. So now the first slide you want to have after your introduction slide, which is something that you can see in both this PowerPoint and the one we did before, is an agenda. Now, this is a great way to kind of set the stage for the story you're about to tell, and it helps the judges follow along and be prepared for the content that is about to come. Now, you can actually pair this with a running footer, which is something that you can see on the bottom of this slide, where it says case introduction, case analysis, and helpful tips. And it will kind of highlight what section you were on. Now, this highlights case analysis, so we know that we are actually in the example case analysis and not in the helpful tip section. It's really helpful if a judge looks away for like a minute or 20 seconds and they kind of get distracted, they can then look back and see where you are in the PowerPoint.
So for this next slide, and this one typically follows the agenda, I want to talk about industry analysis, which in my belief is one of the most important and underutilized slides in this entire presentation. So the goal of the industry analysis is to overview the entire industry, which helps quantify, in this case, Subway, compared to all of its competitors. As you can see, we mentioned Jersey Mike's and Jimmy John's in conjunction to Subway, and you could really see where it falls, not as a standalone business, but as a food business in that industry with competitors like those two that I mentioned. It provides a really strong benchmark and further alludes to some of the direction and of problems and recommendations they will be solving. We mentioned a 13% decrease in US sales, which shows that one of our goals will be to solve that issue and work on expanding and increasing US sales.
So now going into the key issues and problem ID slide, this is where you're going to highlight the problems that you found through your research in the case. Now, here you want to lay out whatever problems you found the company is facing. It could be one huge problem, or it could be 3 different ones. We would recommend going the approach of 3, but if there is one problem that you think you could have 3 recommendations for, go ahead and do that. Now, it is important that you want to have each problem line up with a recommendation. So if you do go the route of having 3 different problems, have 3 recommendations, but if you have one problem, then you can have 3 recommendations to tackle that one problem. So here, what you want to do is you want to provide a little bit of light on each problem that the company is facing before diving into the recommendations, which you're going to follow. So as you can see, we did lags behind market trends, and then we gave more context to what that actually means. So we said that Subway doesn't officially cater to the growing population of vegan and health conscious individuals. So in this instance, we kind of said what is happening, and then we said what trends it is not following. Now, this will go right before your recommendation brief, and in the recommendation brief, you're going to give a little bit of information, kind of in the similar style to what you did with the problem ID. We're going to say improve franchise relations in a very vague statement, and then give a little bit of more information on what that actually means. So that would be through lower royalties for franchises and higher external development agents. Now, in this, you're going to have your 3 recommendations, and you do need to have 3 recommendations in each of your presentations. So make sure that you do. But this is a good way to kind of highlight what recommendations you're going to implement. And it will give a brief description of your recommendations and also show a qualitative result of these solutions. So make sure your recommendations are very neatly laid out here before diving into the specific information on each recommendation.
So following your recommendation overview, what you want to do is really elaborate and build out those recommendations. And the best way to do that is to go as in-depth as possible and to consistently and constantly answer the how question and the why question. Why are you going to solve this problem? What's the purpose of it in the beginning? And how are you going to do it? And what we have here is just one of a few slides that we ended up using to talk about the franchise relation problems and how we plan on solving it. But as we mentioned, this is our presentation that we presented in Management 111, and we're showing you glimpses of it, not for you to copy, but for you to get a little bit of a taste of what a presentation looks like. I also want to preface that because it was the MCGE board making it, we have a lot more experience than first semester freshmen who just entered campus. So please do not feel any pressure to make it look like this or to be held up to this standard of quality. But to go into this slide a little bit more, it's going to be following the recommendation overview slide. And one thing that you have to keep in mind is that the recommendations that you pitch constantly and consistently tie back to the problem and really making sure that there's that consistency aspect. I'm going to keep saying it. That consistency is absolutely key. And it's something that will immediately knock points off your presentation if it isn't there. And as I mentioned, the goal is to really recommend upfront how you're going to accomplish that solution and how you're going to solve that business problem. What we have here is, I believe, the second slide of a different recommendation we did. And we wanted to showcase it because it has a really cool prototype of a phone on it. And we are big proponents of prototyping. And because it focuses on a little bit of a different aspect of the recommendation slides. And here, that aspect is to really break down the recommendation into a more granular form. The previous slide we showed was a problem overview, but a more in-depth problem overview than before. And this one really goes in depth on how we're going to make that solution. What we really want to emphasize is to use visuals in some way, whether that's graphs, charts, pictures, or prototypes like we have. So that way the judges and everybody watching can follow the material in a really easy and digestible manner. Because as we know, a picture really is worth 1,000 words. When it comes to the slides in general, how many recommendation slides we recommend, there honestly is no set number. People typically keep it between 2 and 3 slides, but whatever you need is great as long as you're as thorough and as organized as possible. And another thing to keep in mind is that whatever projections you use have to be backed by both research and logic. And if you want to have more information explaining sources and how you came to that conclusion, we recommend making an appendix after you finish the thank you slide and then putting all the extra information there. And in an appendix, the information doesn't really have to look too pretty. So it's a really great way to put any questions, any answers to questions you think may be asked and any sources.
So now a really important step is the implementation timeline, because you're going to come up with great ideas, but it's a matter of if you can actually implement these ideas. And a lot of questions that judges are going to ask you are actually going to be about the implementation, because that is such a key step in coming up with your ideas, is making it actually realistic and mapping it out in the future. So it's important to make sure that you have addressed pretty much all the aspects of your recommendations and how you're going to be implementing them at the company. There are a bunch of different ways you can actually display this. So this right here is kind of just a simple timeline. You can also do a Gantt chart or a flow chart, but we contact us if you want more examples. You can also find them online or feel free to ask your Management 111 mentors, because they will have a bunch of different example case decks that they can show you and show you how to create this sort of stuff. But actually jumping into this case, into this slide, what you want to do is you want to break it down by in a timeline and just say step-by-step basis how you're actually going to implement that recommendation. So for our first recommendation, we would inform current agents their duties and be relieved and begin hiring. And then we'll carry that out until 2025. So it's actually a 3-year plan. It's really important to have varying different levels of plans because your recommendations are all a little bit different. So they're not going to start and end at the same date. And make sure you just cover every single step about how you would actually implement that recommendation at the company.
So jumping into the financial results slide really quickly, this could be one of the most daunting and overwhelming slides for students, and we were there and understand it, but it's also a really important one, and that with time and proper research can really bring your presentation to the next level. Before I get into it, one thing I want to bring to your attention is that most judges, when they ask questions at the end of the case, will ask you how you got your financial calculations. So it's really important that they're sound and that they're rooted in true empirical logic and sources online. So making sure that you have that, developed out beforehand, and that you have the further breakdown and how you actually got to those calculations in your appendix is what differentiates solid financials from amazing financials. So one of the most important things is to have a visual on the slide that depicts how at the end of the day, the revenues that you make will be more than the cost that it incurs. As you can see, the costs for year one are negative, meaning that the costs outweigh the revenue, and that's okay. Most companies are okay, especially ones on the scale of Spotify, absorbing that cost. But you have to ensure that by the time the case is done, which is your last year in the chart, you're showing that they're making a substantial profit. So one thing that we consider in the actual implementation of financials is using the recommendation approach, which is pretty in-depth, or the income statement approach, which is pretty high level and takes actual research and looking at an analysis of the company's income statements. Financial position can also be based on industry benchmarks, which is why it's so important that you have that industry analysis early on and you have those competitors that have already been solidified as within the same industry to showcase how Subway can, in theory, do something Jimmy John's did and incur a fairly similar cost.
So after showing how your company is going to be impacted financially, there is a great way to track your recommendations going forward, and that is through KPIs. So KPIs are necessary to measure the success and effectiveness of your recommendations, because it's actually going to measure if they're tackling the issues at hand. Now, in the instance of Subway, in the improved relations recommendation and problem, we would look to see a 75% decrease in arbitration cases among franchises, because that is one of the big problems that they were facing. So a KPI here would be, has this been met by a certain timeline? And you want to do this for all of your recommendations and frame them to look at a recommendation from a qualitative or quantitative view. That can be posed in questions like, has there been a decrease in customer complaints? And it's just a great way to kind of measure each step of each recommendation to make sure that it's actually coming true. And it's a little bit different than the financial take where you're just looking at costs or revenue. You're actually looking at the smaller, breaking it down into a finer view.
One thing we always recommend, as I mentioned earlier, is having a plan B. So as with any recommendation, you're proposing the company does something really big and drastic. And at the end of the day, there will always be risks associated with it. And that's perfectly okay to pitch. But what separates the good decks from the great decks are the ones that not only identify what those risks are, but propose potential mitigations and propose a plan B. That plan B doesn't necessarily have to be as developed, but the goal of it is to showcase that you're really thinking of things from all angles, like true professional consultants do. And in terms of risks specifically, they can cover a myriad of different topics, such as external risks from competitors, technological risks, financial risks, you name it. They go on and on. And it's important to try to find the risk that is most closely associated with the recommendation that you pitch. Mitigations, as I mentioned, are those plan Bs and those potential steps to solve them and really combat that to make sure that regardless of what extenuating circumstances arise, Subway, in this case, will still be able to thrive. And then one thing that we want to always point out is that you shouldn't tailor risks to mitigations. You should first create those risks, figure out what issues can potentially plague your recommendations, and then after create the mitigations to make them as consistent, there's that word again, as possible.
So in order to wrap up your presentation, because it is going to be a 10-minute presentation, you kind of want to have an executive summary at the end just to show your key takeaways slide and kind of put a little nice bow on it, present it to people for the end. It's a great chance to kind of go over what problems you're tackling, as well as your recommendations, and just remind them of those recommendations, because you are going to be spending a lot of time on the tail end of your presentation, and they might have forgotten what maybe your first problem was or your first recommendation. So it's a great way to remind them before you close out and you get into the Q&A session. But you do want to tie each recommendation back together to show the overall benefits created. So in this instance, you could say, so to start, one of the problems we were looking at was franchise relationships are currently tense. In order to tackle this, we recommend lowering royalties, which we think will award franchise increased freedom and ease out these tensions. Now, in this slide, what you really want to do is just summarize how your recommendations are going to impact the company on a whole, and tackle the overarching problem that you identified to start off with.
So moving away from the case example a little bit and talking about some key takeaways. So to reiterate the structure, your deck should contain, and when I say should, we're very strongly recommending it, problem ID, which can be whatever length you want, but typically 1 or 3 is best, 3 recommendations, implementations, financial implications, and risks and mitigations. And obviously the best way to differentiate your team is through a visually appealing title slide, use of an agenda, a running footer, amazing graphics, so on and so forth, and really thorough analysis. Another thing that we want to talk about is that when it comes to actual presentations, each team member should be roughly speaking for the same amount of time. It's not perfect, but as you can see with Eamon and I, we've been switching off the slides that we present. And at the end of the day, if you were to analyze how much we both talk, it should be pretty similar, which is exactly what you want with your teammates when you present. You also shouldn't just throw bullet points on a slide. We've seen that plenty where people just have a few words with no graphics to accompany it, and the words are kind of standalone. And that's not really a great thing. It doesn't look too professional, and that won't advance you to the next round. And another thing to keep in mind, which is something that even we have issues with from time to time, is that you are not the company. You are not Spotify or Subway. You are a consultant that has been hired to help them. So make sure to address them as, we recommend implementing this for your company, because at the moment you do not work for them. You are a contracted hire. When it comes to submitting your presentation, please send PowerPoint and a PDF and not a Google slide, just those two, to the email listed. And as I mentioned, any presentation that is in Google Slides will not be accepted. And when it comes to the research, you do have a lot of research that you have to do because it is a fairly long case and it is a fairly competitive one. So just know that the more research you do and the more thorough you are, the better your odds are of having that quality presentation and advancing. And one thing I know that freshmen struggle with is what you can put on a resume, and having a case competition win or advancing to the next round looks incredible and is something that employers really love seeing.
So in order to build a professional PowerPoint, you want to use all of these different assets. So one thing that we've used throughout is SmartArt. Sorry. So SmartArt is able to can be used to organize slides very effectively and make it look very aesthetically pleasing. So on this slide, you can see that if we just had these words up here in bullet points, it would not be very easily digestible, and it wouldn't even look that great. So you wouldn't want to watch a 10-minute presentation of just words on a slide. So make sure to use SmartArt and make your slides very detailed and organized, so that it is more enjoyable for both you and the judges. You also want to make sure that when you are using SmartArt, make sure that all the shapes match the slides message, and make sure that all the shapes are lined up and that it's just not just thrown on there. You want to make sure that it's very neat and tidy. You also want to just stick to conservative colors and fonts. Don't go out there with like a wild green. I mean, you could for Spotify, but don't just have everything as green. You want to make sure that maybe the background is white and that it's not glowing in the faces of your judges, because that could distract them from actually whatever you're putting on the slides. The text should also be concise and very easy to read, and you don't actually want to have too many bullet points. You kind of want to have words that you want the slides to have less words than what you're saying, and you want to add on to everything that's on the slide. You don't want to just read off the slides. And then we really recommend against using transitions and animations, because it is just another thing that distracts judges from what you're putting on the slides. And you want to make sure that everyone understands the entire presentation. So you want each team member to really participate in creating everything, so that when it comes time to Q&A, you guys are all prepared to answer questions. And another note is when it comes to times to Q&A, you want to make sure that you guys are all answering questions and it's not just one person. Otherwise, it might seem like that one person did all the work, which is really a negative look for your team as a whole. But you guys can check out more of our tips on MCG's YouTube channel, which you can find on YouTube, and we can also send the link if needed.
So just for one final logic check, does our presentation include 3 problem identifications and 3 recommendations? Obviously, that's a question you should be asking yourself when you actually are getting ready to submit it. Does our presentation have an implementation plan with financial implications and risk considerations? Do our recommendations directly answer and consistently answer the problem areas that we identified? And finally, is the presentation easily visible for the judges when being presented? A good tip that we recommend is to go to a roommate or go to somebody who might not even be in SOM and ask them to listen into your presentation or to look through their PowerPoint, because there's somebody who is likely familiar with Spotify since it's a popular app, but doesn't understand the material at hand. So ensuring that somebody with no experience understands it would mean that your presentation is very digestible and is hopefully aesthetically pleasing, which is exactly what you want to submit at the end of the day.
So thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you found it very useful. Like we said, if you have any questions, we're going to have a help session on Tuesday, September 6th in Classroom Wing 102. So thank you guys.